Hi everyone, this video is just to correct the mistakes I made or elaborate on some things and mention some things I forgot and update you all. First, I'm going to cover my first video, which is what if the West was Orthodox and the East was Catholic. The first mistake I made is probably that in order for the East to be Catholic, without the West being Catholic, is that the Patriarch of Antioch should have been the one to declare supremacy, since according to the Orthodox, Peter was the first Patriarch of Antioch, and that Saint Linus was the first Bishop of Rome. And as many of you know, Peter having the keys is the whole justification for Catholics having papal supremacy. Moving on, I mentioned that the Catholic Church made Prussia poorer, and some of you heard it as Russia and thought that in our timeline Russia is Catholic, but Russia is actually Orthodox in our timeline. Prussia is a place in northern Germany. Moving on, I mentioned the Coptic Pope, and some of you were like, so wait, there's two popes? Well, yes, but the Coptic Pope doesn't play the role as the superior of the other bishops. He's just a spokesman for his church. The same goes for the patriarchs in the Eastern Orthodox churches. And I was probably wrong when I said that one of the kings of Russia would team up with one of the sultans of the Ottoman Empire in that video, since with a point of departure as far back as 1054, the Ottoman Empire might be butterflied out of existence. But I'm sure the Russians would team up with some Muslim power to sack Constantinople. Then later on in that video, you guys thought I was saying some other power, not the Spanish, would conquer and colonize Argentina, since I said that its face would be a lot more northern European. Actually, even though it is a Spanish colony, over 60% of Argentines claim full or partial Italian ancestry. Because its climate is so similar to that of Europe, it attracted many immigrants from Europe, unlike other parts of Latin America. It's just that it didn't attract many from the Protestant areas because they feared they'd be persecuted similarly. Many Italians chose Argentina over the United States because of hate groups like the KKK that killed a lot of Catholics. A lot of you might be wondering at this point, but so much of Chile is so close to so much of Argentina. Therefore, it should have a very similar climate. How come the face of Chile is much more Native American than Argentina? Well, its climate does have some differences, but in some ways, its climate is actually more like that of Spain and Italy's. It's just that because of the Andes Mountains, if you wanted to move from anywhere in the old world to Chile, you would have to go south underneath Argentina, then around to the west of South America before finally going east to Chile. Oftentimes, because of how much the Andes separates Chile, it's called the Britain of South America. And yes, I did make another mistake that one of you pointed out, which was that something as specific as World War I would not happen in this timeline because of all the other butterflies I mentioned, you know? Just taking Napoleon out changes a whole lot, so World War I as we know it in our timeline definitely wouldn't happen in this timeline. On to my video about National Bolshevism. First of all, some of you think the whole concept is extremely far-fetched because Nazi Germany had a good economy, so there would be no reason for them to radically reform their economy into something very socialist. Even if it would guarantee massive Soviet help, and then there's been no time in history where a very capitalist economy, bit by bit, slowly became a socialist one. Well, I think America's economy was doing pretty well under George Bush, and I think it was still doing pretty good under Obama, and it's entirely possible that Bernie Sanders could have become president in the 2016 election. Then some of you were wondering why Nazi Germany would go to war with Franco and Mussolini. Well, I shouldn't need to point this out, but fascists hate Bolshevism. Then there's those of you wondering where France was in all this. I didn't mention France because it would fall just as it did in our timeline. As for why Pearl Harbor ends Russia and Japan's scramble for China, well, Pearl Harbor means Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which means nukes are involved, and the Nazis in the USA will know that if they use them, that would mean mutually assured destruction. Then we get to India and Pakistan, and you guys were wondering why Britain isn't holding on to the subcontinent by the skin of its teeth. Well, where did I say it wouldn't? I didn't want to inflate the length of my video by pointing out tiny details like that, and even if the Brits were the nicest rulers in the world, which they weren't, the pride of the Indians, Pakistanis, Bengalis, Sri Lankans and Nepali people being hurt by being conquered by a tiny island more than a continent away meant they couldn't hold on to it for that much longer. And a mistake I'm surprised you guys didn't pick up on was me talking about the oil shocks of the 1970s. The Natsballs wouldn't have had to experience them since they were allies of the Arab countries, and so they wouldn't have been being punished by them for supporting Israel. However, they would have experienced some problems since the Arab countries' decreasing oil production would have affected them, but not enough for it to be an oil shock, maybe just an oil press. Now to my video about Greece. If you didn't see the connection between Greece being communist and Russia getting a warm water seaport. If Greece remained communist, then it would have joined the Warsaw Pact and become a puppet state of the USSR. And usually the water that borders Russian land freezes in winter, which has hindered Russia a lot historically. But Greece is on the Mediterranean Sea, which is warm and never freezes. And some of you didn't understand the difference between the dictatorship of George Papadopoulos and fascism. Well, there are other definitions of fascism out there, but in my videos, fascism is corporatism, which is the corporations in each field are combined into one, so for every field there's one corporation. Authoritarianism and the belief that the group, typically the nation, is more important than the individual. Now, for how Snow was Stalin's element, well, he had more troops trained specially to fight in the snow than any other army, and he had guys from Siberia trained to do that, which gets much colder than winter in Germany does. Now, I said Greece has the second worst infrastructure in the EU, and yes, I was wrong. I checked it, and I was wrong. My source for this information was a YouTube video, which did have sources in the description, but that YouTube video was deleted. Probably because he got it wrong as well. Greece actually has the 8th worst infrastructure in the EU, and in my alternate timeline, in comparison to the other countries that are in the European Union, Greece would have the 10th worst. Now, I know this doesn't sound like much of a difference, only moving over 2 countries in the EU. However, Cyprus is one of the countries in the EU with better infrastructure than Greece, and since they're one in this timeline, Greece will have better infrastructure than 3 European Union countries than it does in our timeline. Now we move on to the war with Cyprus. Because I mentioned Greek and Turkish Cyprus, one of you accused me of normalizing the illegal Turkish occupation of North Cyprus, since Turkey is the only country that recognizes the Republic of North Cyprus. Okay, then why didn't you interpret that part as Turkey ends up occupying less of Cyprus? Then when I listed the amount of immigrants from the different countries and I said same country on Cyprus, one of you gave me a lecture on Cyprus being a different country. I know that, but in my alternate timeline, Cyprus is a part of Greece. And when I mentioned Portuguese immigrants preferring the weather in France to back home and Portugal having a very similar climate to Greece, many of you said, but I thought Greece had a lovely climate. Well, when I spoke to Luso-French people, they told me they prefer France's weather because summers aren't as hot and they feel the cold less in winter, even though France has colder winters, as French houses are insulated to keep the heat inside, while Portuguese houses are just poorly insulated. And something I learnt since I uploaded that video is that the parts of Albania that Greece will end up occupying in this alternate timeline are insulated to keep the heat inside, so maybe there would be Portuguese immigrants in Greek northern Epirus. Another thing I forgot to mention is that since Greece isn't in the Eurozone in my alternate timeline, they'd be using the drachma, which would have been one of the oldest currencies still in use. And some of you didn't understand how Zambia was made poorer by the Greek crisis. Well, Greece's crisis weakened the value of the euro, the currency. Now, imagine you have some 400 euros in the bank and you need to buy a frying pan and you decide you're going to buy it tomorrow. Then the next day you find out that the euro has lost half of its value overnight. Then you might decide to wait until your next few paychecks to buy your frying pan, which is made of Zambian copper. And I would like to correct myself. I should have said the minimum wage would be equal to about 300 rubles, not 350, as 350 would increase the unemployment rate and debt to GDP ratio too much. Making it 300 rubles per hour would increase Chukotka's unemployment rate to about 9.75%, and its debt to about 26.15%. Other reasons why I picked Chukotka as a comparison include because of the taxation on contraceptives and abortions like Greece has in this alternate timeline. Chukotka also has a young median age, as you can see here. Chukotka's median age is about 33 years old now. In comparison to many of the other countries in the world, you're going to see that's actually quite young compared to many of them, especially in the first world. Like, let's start all the way up top here. You can see Italy, which has an economy pretty similar to Greece in our timeline but avoided an economic crisis. Its age is even older than Greece's, which you see here, and many of the other wealthier countries in Europe are really high up on here. Yeah, like look, Switzerland, that's another one I was considering comparing it to, although it would obviously be one of the poorer regions of Serbia. And Poland is a conservative country that in Europe that doesn't use euros, and look, it's even older. Even older than Russia, which has very low fertility rates since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And yeah, you can see here, Cyprus has a much lower fertility rate than Greece, and it's still not that much younger than Cyprus. Yeah, so Greece would be around here somewhere. And you might be wondering why I'm using outdated information from 2014. Well, that's where my source over here is from. And on to minimum wages. This is Cyprus's minimum wage at purchasing power parity, and this is Greece's, which is loading up right here. As you can see, it's barely higher than Cyprus's, and now this is what I said it would be in the alternate timeline. And you might be wondering, wait, this is 675 rubles, not this 300 rubles that you mentioned earlier. Well, it seems as though some of you didn't know what purchasing power parity was. Purchasing power parity is, for example, GDP per capita. We all know what that is, but it doesn't take into consideration how cheap or expensive things are in the country. So purchasing power parity is just taking into consideration the prices of the country. And so, like, if the average American bought the same things in Russia as they do in the US, they would spend over 2 times less. So that's how you get this 675 figure as opposed to 300. So you multiply it by how much cheaper things are in Russia. Another reason why I picked a part of Russia to be my comparison is because Russia is an Eastern Orthodox Christian dictatorship, just like Greece would be in this alternate timeline. Finally, we move on to my video on the sexual revolution. First off, as to whether people in Rwanda were more or less promiscuous before Catholicism, I've heard that in some parts of Africa there are these guys called the hyenas who have to sexually initiate girls into their adolescence, and most of them have AIDS. And then there's tribes where if a man has a male visitor, he is expected to give him his wife for the night. So if Rwanda was like one of these places before Catholicism, then far less Tutsis would have contracted AIDS in my alternate timeline. However, I heard that some places got more promiscuous because they had to have the consent of their tribe's chief before sleeping with anyone. Then when the Europeans took over, the chief was stripped of his power and the king of whatever European country took his place. And the Africans couldn't ask some king in a faraway land if they could have sex. So if Rwanda was like that, then the amount of AIDS would have been even more or the same in this timeline. On to Nigeria. As to why, if the worst case scenario, if they decided to tackle corruption, would be that Nigeria would be like Iran, is because Iran had a low fertility rate for a while before recovering. Check my video on Greece to see why this would have a similar effect to AIDS killing a lot of people. And Iran has a very large population of very highly educated people and a lot of corruption per capita, but slightly less than Nigeria. And some of you didn't understand why Ireland got rich from having low taxes. It was a combination of low taxation, pro-business regulatory policies, and a young tech-savvy workforce. For many multinationals, the decision to do business in Ireland was made easier still by generous incentives from the Industrial Development Authority. In addition, European Union membership was helpful, giving the country lucrative access to markets that it had previously reached only through the UK and pumping huge subsidies and investment capital into the Irish economy. The economy benefited from a rise in consumer spending, construction, and business investment. And one thing I forgot to mention was that the sexual revolution had very little impact on East Asia, but it still had an impact through pornography. For many people in South Korea and Japan, it has replaced real relationships and sexual intercourse, so it decreased their fertility rate slightly. So I'm going to estimate that South Korea's population would be about 52 million and Japan's would be about 127.5 million in this timeline. Something else I forgot to mention is that even though the West would probably be less homophobic, it would also be more likely to be transphobic, since hormone research was key in transgender surgeries, so less people would see being trans as something legitimate and more would see it as a mental illness. And guys, if you like my anime content, like that one anime video I did, please tell me. Tell me if you guys want me to start doing reviews of the anime that were in that video. If you want me to start doing live reactions to new anime episodes, you know. Maybe I'll even try my hand at AMVs if enough of you request it, but please let me know. And I'm not going to start working on my next alternate history timeline until I get 190 subscribers. So please share this around and subscribe, and peace out.